Right, pronouns are, good afternoon. That is the extent of my Welsh. We call it my home country. I'm adopted there. I'm not as you can see, or hear, I imagine, originally from there. So, what are we going to talk about today? So, I've been given the task of talking to the theme of, here we go, data linkage, methods, systems, and technology. Not many of you in the audience will know me because I'm not known for any of those things. I am known for my work around homelessness prevention. And as I was talking to others today, is the reason I'm in this space around administrative data is because of the goal of ending homelessness, of preventing homelessness. And one of the mechanisms and the routes through which we can do that is use of linked administrative data. But as an important caveat, I am not a statistician. I'm not a methodologist in this space. So I'm entirely dependent on folk like you to make this happen. And I'm actually, more specifically, in anything I've published with a number in it, entirely dependent on Dr. Ian Thomas. And I think it's really important to say this, because he could easily be giving this presentation. And I kind of always say we're like this double act, and I've tended to refer to us as Ant and Dec. But you guys are more sophisticated than our usual audience, so I thought it's more like Elton John and Bernie Taupin. So Ian is the writer behind it, and I get to stand up. I forgot my glasses, but I get to stand up and sing the song. So that's me. I'm going to be Elton today. Right. So what are we going to do? 3 things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about be optimistic. In the space that I work, where we're talking about homelessness, where the trajectory is problematically going up the way and in the wrong direction, we're going to be optimistic and say, well, what would the ideal homelessness administrative data system look like? What would be the ingredients of the ideal system that helps us achieve our goal? And that's drawing on some work we did for an EU cost action, and I've written about it in the European Journal of Homelessness. So what would the ideal components be? It will have resonance beyond homelessness, don't switch off. Then, what I wanted to do, and this is where I'll spend a good bit of time, is looking under the bonnet of some of those systems. So based on a bit of reading and some informal conversations, look under the bonnet of how did we get to some of these awesome systems that are enabling us to answer the important policy questions that we want to answer. Moving away from the technical solutions that we'll perhaps focus on at the start and into some of the more qualitative dimensions. And really give praise thanks to those that have done all the hard work that enable us to answer some of the questions. And then finally, I got given a platform, so I'm going to talk a little bit about homelessness prevention and just give a couple of examples of how we can use actually imperfect data within imperfect systems still to help us answer important policy questions. We'll give 2 examples there in the final part of the presentation. And like our morning speaker, there will be 1 opportunity for participation. So it seems like that's a theme. So if you're speaking tomorrow, you've got to get some participation in. Otherwise, you're an outlier. Right. So the ideal homelessness data system. It was a very basic review, evidence review. Ian led it. We looked at about 50 different systems, primarily homelessness data infrastructures and systems, collections. But also some systems that are outside of homelessness, so health, where, for instance, they're often a little bit further advanced in their design. And what we found kind of in the starting point, if we're going to talk about an ideal system, we need to be measuring ideal against something. Ideal in terms of what? And what we landed on is purpose, the system purpose. You can see the conclusion there, but really, when we talk about administrative data, I think most of us have probably started a paper that says administrative data is the exhaust of operations. Hands up if you've done that. Okay, just us. Right, okay. So you talk about administrative data being the exhaust of operations, but no. Actually, if we're designing the ideal system, then there are other purposes in mind. And the ideal system is designed with at least these 3 purposes and probably others in mind. So 1 being measurement, and in the homelessness context, in the homelessness sector, that's our obsession. We want to measure prevalence, and at best we want to measure the effectiveness of some of our activities or our outcomes. That's the extent of what we're doing. And you can see that globally in any number of different systems. HUD system in America gives you reliable data about prevalence of homelessness over time, and you can talk about whether federal policy is having an impact. So that's one thing, measurement. The other one, and crucial to us and most of us in the room, is research. So having systems deliberately designed to enable research. And I promise I'm only going to go to Scandinavia once in my examples. We could spend a long time there, but the Scandinavians, Denmark in particular, gives us a really good example where the system is designed for and enables research. So they have Section 110 accommodation, which is their social services accommodation. We have data on everybody that enters that system, and through their population data linkage spine, you can then follow those folk very easily into these other systems and undertake research, whether that's on mortality, psychiatric disorder, etc., etc. It's all been done. And when I talk to colleagues, Lars Benjaminson and others who are working in that space in Denmark, we talk very enviously to them who can do this at a click of a button. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we have in the UK context of doing anything remotely similar. So designing for research is our second purpose that we should be taking into consideration. And then operational uses. So for designing administrative data systems, they have to be designed with operational use in mind. And I don't mean using our own data within our own organization to make operational decisions. That's a given. I mean that we're able to access data from other organizations, from other parts of the system, to feed back in to guide us live to make operational decisions. And there is, for instance, an example even in London. We've got the chain database system, which has at the front end, if I'm a service provider, and there are many service providers working with street homeless populations, I can access that system, I can see data about the client, the individual I'm working with, but underneath that, there's a case-based system with lots of other information about the individual that, through various permissions, I can access so that I can manage that person's case and support them effectively. Yeah, so that's operational use and data linkage. And I think we saw, or we heard some examples in the sessions that I was in where they exist in plenty. Good. So that's our three uses. And our conclusion at the end of that is, as you can see up here, look, as a guiding principle, yes, everything is going to be context dependent, and we'll kind of elaborate on that in a bit. But we argue that administrative data systems that mobilize data for measurement, research, and operational purposes that work across different scales, whether that's national, local, community, federal, provincial, have an increased potential to contribute to our ultimate goal of ending homelessness. So that's the purpose of our system, and we need it doing all of those things. Does the ideal system exist? I wait to hear examples coming. But that's our system purpose. Oh, we've turned on the other mics. Okay. Right, moving on then. So what we've done is we drew out kind of five ingredients or five design preferences that we wanted to talk to in terms of our ideal system. The first one being system architecture, and we landed on, in our review across all of these systems, a preference for a centralized system where the data was pooled, it was there in perpetuity for us to be able to access readily and easily to be able to, again, address our research questions and inform policy and practice. But that crucial thing about persisting over time is key, without having to engage in the kind of lengthy data collection processes each time we want to ask a question. So a centralized system was the preference. Then on data quality. We talk about adopting a kind of multifaceted approach through standardization, monitoring, and automated validation. I'm not going to dwell on any of the technicalities of that, but what I will do is shift a little bit towards the ethics of data quality. And we heard a fantastic talk this morning, but we heard a little bit about it around data quality there. There are those that argue, World Health Organization argues, we shouldn't be onward sharing data for research if we've got any concerns about the data quality. because of the potential ethical implications on people's lives of a policy that gets developed on imperfect data or data that might be misleading. On the second point there around monitoring and kind of maintenance of data quality, again, we get into kind of ethical issues. Often, we devolve the responsibility around data quality, or we lay the blame on data quality to the poor souls at the front line who are the ones inputting the data. Okay, that's where our monitoring and our training goes. And of course, these frontline workers in the homeless context, they're care workers. They didn't come into the job to collect your data so that you can produce another paper for the International Journal of Population Data Sciences, plug number 1. Right? They didn't. That's not what they went into the job for. So we've got a whole educational piece about why that data is important, how that data might be used. But it changes that role, and it can potentially, if we need this data, change the nature of that interaction. Yeah? Let's just add one more variable. I want to know where they come from, because we've got an issue around immigration and homelessness. I want to know if you've had any interaction with the prison services, because we're struggling to link the data, and I need to know so I can take back to criminal justice and tell them what a bad job they're doing around their discharge planning. So we're going to ask people about that. And by the way, we're interested in intersectionality and issues around gender. We're going to ask about that. And each time we add this little bit of burden on, we're changing the nature of that caring interaction. And if you remember, if we come back to the first slide, what's our goal? It's ending homelessness. And we may have just changed the nature of that interaction that says, do you know what? If every time I go into that provision, this is what I have to do, I'm not going to go into that provision. I'm not going to access the help. So we enter this kind of issue around, we need good data quality, otherwise we can't use it. But actually, sometimes our processes and our mechanisms for achieving that can be counterproductive to our overarching goal. Right, on then to ethico-legal. So this is where we really enter the issues of ethics. Super careful consideration required. We heard about examples of where things go wrong, and that comes up in the literature too. And in our paper, we argue for this combination of consent, legislation, obligation. And just to dwell on, problematize a couple of those. So we've got examples in Chicago, their standard homelessness monitoring system. It operates this shared case management system. So people have access, other service providers have access, a bit like Chain in London. And when they're having the interaction with a person, we ask for consent. Are you okay? And there are degrees of consent for me to share your data with other providers. Which, again, sounds very, very good, very well intended, but can have, again, potential implications and tensions. What if I feel, well, actually, then, in which case, to access the service that you're offering me, I've got to give consent? Are we making it really clear that the provision of a service is not dependent on your consent to me sharing some data? So again, we keep coming out, and I think we got it this morning where there was a really good question asked, well, how do you address that conundrum? I don't have the answers. These are things that are playing out. And then, on the other hand, we have obligation, which is one of, and again, in the US, this is quite commonplace, and in Canada, we use obligation. So if you're going to receive funding, then you are under a duty to return this data. Yeah? Which means the communities that are providing homelessness services have to collect the data, have to return it. UK context, we tend to use legislation, but obligation with funding in the US and Canadian context, that has implications and problems. So if I'm accessing these services and I'm aware that I'm going to have to provide you guys with my data every time I come in, maybe I'm not going to want to come into those services. Maybe I have a reason to want to be slightly under the radar. I need support, but maybe my immigration status is a little bit uncertain. So that forces me into what we call much, much lower threshold services. Yeah. So again, all of these issues need to be taken into consideration when we're designing this ideal system. Moving on to data sharing and privacy. Look, if we want to understand person-level experiences, we need personal data. But our argument for our system is that the default should be de-identification, and we only retain personal identifiable data where it's a case management system and we need to be able to identify the person to support them. But de-identification as the default, and really just picking up on some of the interesting technical practices and fixes that address the concerns of all of these organizations who are not used to necessarily sharing data. So de-identification at point of service. So we had examples, I think the example used in the paper is from Australia, the Specialist Homelessness Service National Minimum Data Set, where they just used a unique identifier based on their personal information, and then each service uses that same mechanism for arriving at a unique person level number. So data sharing and privacy. Then finally, and before we move on to the even more fun and less technical stuff, data access. It is no use creating the most ethically informed data administration system that intends to help us end homelessness if you are not going to give people access. If you are not going to give people access. And I don't just mean to you guys who are super intelligent, way better with numbers and statistics than I am. I mean access to people like me who are interested in policy and practice. I mean for people in community organizations that need this data to shape what they're doing. So we have to find ways of making data available to a whole range of levels of data literacy and information literacy. And so some of the examples, that might be that we use aggregate data and we create platforms or whatever, and those exist. It could be the kind of raw data formats that many of us are accessing, or it can be a kind of a somewhere in between where we've got mediated access. And again, in America, we've got a couple of examples. You've got Stellar P, which basically you can upload their homelessness data sets, and it models and it benchmarks and it does all sorts. They've got Stellar M, where you can put in interventions and it kind of projects changes and effects of these different interventions. So lots of different options, and I'm not sure we've cracked that one at all yet. So that's it for our kind of principles of the ideal system. That was more of the technical side. Now on to the qualitative, the fun bit. So this is far less robust. It's not based on a study of 50 data systems, though it does draw on some of that literature and other literatures, but it's equally informed by informal conversations with some of the awesome people who sit behind a few of these data sets. And I'm going to draw out, there's 4 slides, 7 themes maybe, and this is not robust. This is like me exposing my proper qualitative researcher. Let's just get some interesting stuff on the slide. So they're really just under the bonnet. What do we learn about? How do we arrive at these systems that we want? So pragmatism and patience is the first one. So we had this wonderful quote from one of the informal discussions that says, look, these systems are artifacts of the environment we work in. And it's very much related to the idea of pragmatism. When you're trying to design a system that enables you to address whatever your goal is, in my case it would be ending homelessness, you've got to work from where you're at. If you're working in a country that is a federal state, you've got your provinces acting, and in each province you've got a different community providing those services, legislated to provide those services, then running a centralized system is going to be quite tricky. If you're in a state where all services are run centrally by the state, then your centralized system sounds like a good fix. And that's the lesson, is we can have the ideal, but sometimes we have to work with the reality. And when you look at the architects and talk to the architects of these systems, that's what they say. David, Karina, and co, who developed SAIL, when you read their papers, it talks very much about pragmatism. How did we arrive at the SAIL data bank? There was a whole load of pragmatism went into we had public services that simply didn't have the data infrastructure to do what we needed to do. They did and created that. So pragmatism defining design. And then this one's going to be more like a cathartic session for us all because we're in this space, which is patience. This is one example of us trying to get the criminal justice data in. So we wanted police data. So we had a conversation with the Police and Crime Commissioner in South Wales, They really wanted to look at homelessness. We really wanted to look at the relationship with interactions with the police. We both wanted it to happen. The conclusion to this is it took 2 years. I was still quite young to this. No, I wasn't. But anyway, at the time I thought, it felt like forever. But now when I see this slide, which Ian produced, I kind of think, that's quick. Like 2 years, that's rapid, isn't it? We've had much longer journeys. We got our first local authority homelessness data in, Ian, 2017? Where is he? Ian, was about 2017? We're still trying to get our second local authority data set in since then. So things just take time, don't they? But look, in the reading, there's one quote that I think does a better job than our graph there. So they say, look, exploring the relationship of education and health outcomes for children and young people in England required 3 years, 11 months, 6 meetings, and at least 108 email and telephone correspondences to gain approval for the linkage of the required data. This is our therapy session, guys. We're all facing the same challenge. So patience is what I've learned. And that means funders, we need patience. Policymakers are often the worst ones. They think it can happen tomorrow. We need patience. Academics, we need patience. If you're employing, bringing on a PhD student, you need the data in because you're going to wait 3 years before you've got the data. Patience in our design, our development, and sustainability of these systems. Perhaps the key ingredient that comes out again in the literature and the conversations was trust and relationships. So across sectors, at all organizational levels, and often commencing to build this trust with really kind of small pro bono bits of work. Yeah. So test, learn, prove concept, answer a useful question. Yeah. Do that, and then we open the doors to accessing more data and getting more data into the system. Time and time again, that's how we see these systems have evolved, these data infrastructures have evolved. And then through that, often we begin to institutionalize some of those relationships and again, leads to greater sustainability. There were two kind of Alberta examples that we refer to in the literature that talk about, look, I started with these ministers, they were really on board, they wanted it to make it happen in terms of this data linkage. We made it happen, and then ministers move on. If we're working in England in homelessness, ministers move on kind of every 6 weeks. So you can't build a system based on that. So your system then, and again, the lessons are, well, then we move down, or we start with officials at lower levels. We build those relationships. But it's also about the community relationships, the people about whom you're collecting the data, relationships there. So a really clear set of messages there. And it's at all stages, from inception, idea development, to getting the data in, doing the research, and crucially around the influencing and the dissemination work. I think we forget that sometimes, and I put on there a really interesting example from the Be-Bold system in southern Australia, where they've done a whole load of work around indigenous data sovereignty. And the argument that they made was, we were doing a piece of work. Once again, we proved the problematic experiences, the challenging experiences of indigenous communities, and we were about to go live with this. We had the findings, we were talking to the communities about what we'd found, and the message basically came back and says, we do not need another report that talks about, and skews the language, but this was theirs, how shit our lives are. We don't need another report that says that. And so the data analysts took that data out. They changed the report. They took out those messages, those findings. Being responsible to the communities about whom you're talking about. So that trusting relationships, and it's only through those that these systems, they work. So it was a really powerful example. We're nearly there. A Field of Dreams, right? I managed to get a Kevin Costner quote into this one. Actually, I didn't. It was in one of the informal discussions. They said, look, Pete, the key lesson is if you build it, they will come. I was like, did you seriously just say that? I'm seeing the younger ones at the back, like, I don't know what you're talking about. Or the cool guys that don't watch those sorts of films. Anyway, I do. And I was like, wow, okay, great. I'm using that in the presentation. So build it and they'll come. And basically the argument was, if you're doing policy relevant stuff, those infrastructures will survive. People need that data. They will act on it. They will use that data. So ground up, ask strategically important questions, and those systems will sustain. But to do that, the argument is you need to be deeply embedded in those communities of practice, of the communities about whom you're producing data, etc. And also a really interesting point about the data you're using, because it's administrative data, is grounded in the outcomes of interest to those communities. And I say that because I'm currently getting dragged screaming and kicking into trials, so randomized controlled trials, which we don't do in the homelessness space in the UK context. So we're trying to advance that. And the number of difficult conversations I've had with public health folk about the outcomes that they want to put in these surveys is incredible. ICE Cap A. These measures that are intended to measure well-being and health, and you think, actually, we've got much better outcomes in the administrative data, if only we could access those. So we're grounded in the outcomes of interest. Again, they're more likely to sustain these systems. Right, we're nearly there in terms of the system lessons. The last one, 3 themes, they're slightly related. Ideas of adaptability, skills, and sustainability. So on the point of adaptability, really the message was you can design the system as you like, but it's going to change over time. And we see that in a lot of the stuff, again, written about SAIL, about continually developing new processes, responding to legislative change around data protection, about people saying, we want to deposit new data, and you have to find workarounds or different ways of accessing data. So being adaptable. These systems don't stay static. Skills. Okay, so I've got one, I'll give an example, and over lunch I picked up another one. But skills. Normally the people coming into this have great ideas, they know what the data infrastructure is going to look like, the questions it's going to answer, and they come with some research skills. The one set of skills that normally arises pretty quickly that you need that you don't necessarily have is the legal expertise. And we don't talk about those expertise when we're designing these systems enough. And then, I won't name, but then I was having a really interesting conversation at lunch, and we talk about, yeah, but sometimes you need the trusted environment. I know it's all online now, but trusted environments are sometimes a physical building, and they certainly were until not very long ago in the UK context. We need somebody that knows about building design. We need folk that know about building design in order for us to make this provision and make it accessible and enable researchers to come in and actually use the data systems. So all these skills that you pick up along the way in order to deliver infrastructures that can help us answer our questions. But skills. And then finally, sustainability. And I've mentioned it a few times. How do we make sure these things are there in perpetuity or for as long as we need them? And really, this is reflecting some bitter conversations that says, we haven't got what you've got in the UK with all this ADR investment. ADR enables some of these things to persist and sustain and for us to do all the different presentations that we've got going on here. But the message from the literature really says, if you can get these infrastructures serving really useful purposes for the routine functions of institutions, whether it's government or others, they're more likely to sustain. But, in other contexts, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about whether these infrastructures that have been developed, these systems that have been developed, can be sustained. So, that's it for our insights under the bonnet of some of these infrastructures. What I'd like to do, just because I've got you, is talk a little bit about homelessness specifically now. So despite the fact that we really don't have the ideal homelessness data system, that's why we were having to imagine it, despite the fact that we don't have it, we have to do something. We have to do our best to inform, shape, reflect on policy so that we can achieve our goal of ending homelessness. And if we can't end it, that we make it rare, brief, and unrepeated if it does happen. So we're going to give two examples. The first one is something called rapid rehousing. Right. I'm going to throw one question out. If somebody is homeless, Ian, you can't play this game. If somebody is homeless, what's our default response? Somebody's homeless, they've become homeless. What's our default response? What should we do? Just shout out. What do we do? House. That would be the logical answer, wouldn't it? Somebody's homeless. No. And the number of times I have conversations with people and they say, Pete, there's this empty building down the end of the high street that's just come up. That would make a great hostel. That would make a great hostel. Hostel, shelter, temporary accommodation. That's our default response, not a house. Our default response, and we seem to have accepted it as a society, is temporary accommodation. Pretty poor temporary accommodation. In Cardiff, where I was, the default, we were using floor space. Floor space. Sleeping bag, sleeping bag, sleeping bag, until COVID. And that was accepted. That was our default. So understandably, there's been a policy shift to something called rapid rehousing, which means let's move people from homelessness as quickly as we can into settled homes, into homes. Logical, right? Hands up if you agree with the principle of rapid rehousing. You know I'm setting you up for something. Get your hands up. If you don't agree, get out, right? So we have a policy that says let's move towards rapid rehousing. And it's fascinating. It's in Scottish, it's in Welsh, it's in English policy. Scotland and Wales moving a little bit quicker in those regards. We wanted to explore this. We wanted to look at it. Let's test. How are we getting on then with this policy development? You'd think it'd be easy, wouldn't you? Simple question. Now we get onto the bit that I'd actually designed to be audience participation. Despite having this policy, and it's globally recognized as a policy, there is no definition of rapid. We don't know what we mean. It's in policy and we don't know what we mean. So let's help inform our respective devolved governments and Americans and colleagues, and Chile will be copying soon, our Chilean colleagues. How fast was rapid? How fast do you think we should move people into settled accommodation? What would you say is rapid? You can give it to me in days, months, years, I don't care. Just hand up so I can see you and then we'll get, go on. Same day. Okay, thanks. Hours, good. Go on, hand up so I can see it, yeah. 10 days, good. Within a week. Oh, I knew I was in a socially progressive conference, yeah. 30 days, and we've got a realist as well. Good, good. Right. That's really good. If I do this at a homelessness conference, I'll get a much bigger range because they're in the field and they know the reality of what's about to come on the next slide. So we couldn't get this data. We can't even get this data in Wales. It's a policy, but we can't get it. The only place we could get it quickly, we could do something in England now, but in Scotland at the time. So Scotland gave us it in aggregate form. This wasn't case level. They gave it in aggregate. The median number of days was 154. 154, and we have a policy of rapid rehousing. Yeah, that's one super small bit of data analysis that just tells us how far away we are from achieving our policy goal. And we might think, well, that's an interesting thing because nobody had done this. We still can't do it in Wales. Nobody had done it. But actually, how important is rapid? Because in Scotland, a lot of the temporary accommodation looks a little bit like social housing. It's not the floor space that I was describing in Cardiff. So maybe if the housing looks a bit like social housing and we could flip the tenancy and make it settled, actually that's less problematic. We need to dig into it. And so the project that we've had as part of ADR that we're trying to do is to unearth this and to explore it. At what point do things become problematic in terms of duration of homelessness? Does the type of temporary accommodation matter? Does it affect men and women differently? Does household size matter? But to dig under this, and again, we're in the wait. Ian, 2 years again? It's our usual waiting time. 2 years we've been waiting to get the case level data out of Scottish Government to be able to go to the next stage of this. Patience. So, that's rapid rehousing. It was just a chance to talk to you about, one, to mention how bad our data is currently, and two, just to tell you the sorts of things it can let us begin to answer. And the second one, how am I doing for time? Where's my timekeeper that was going to keep an eye? Doing all right. So the next one, we're talking about administrative data informing policy in challenging times. You know, we've literally just coming through the pandemic. There's no better example of challenging times to talk about. Now, when COVID hit, people experiencing homelessness were a group about whom we were exceptionally worried in a way I have never seen. Homelessness was treated as a public health emergency in a way that it has never done before. For good reason, because if you are in the sort of accommodation that I described to you, you are at great risk of COVID spreading, and you have a whole number of comorbidities that put you at greater risk of basically dying or of serious infection. So there was great concern, and it was justified. There was a whole load of modelling work done by colleagues in UCL that said, look, we really need to act. And in fairness to all of the devolved governments, there was swift action that said, let's get people into self-contained accommodation really quickly and make sure that they stay separate. Okay, that happened. It happened at pace and at scale. You may not have been aware, but they were basically commandeering any accommodation they could get. University accommodation. Nobody's there? Great, we'll have it. People can go into that. Hotels, you probably have heard about that. We'll have it so that people could self-contain. It's not a permanent solution, but people were then protected from potential impacts of COVID. So we had this policy, and then qualitatively, we'd already produced qualitative research that said this seems to be a success, but nobody could actually answer the question around prevalence. Yeah, we could talk about prevalence of other population groups, but nobody was doing it around homelessness. Now, our case level data didn't let us answer it, so we had to go into the health data and a number of other data sets, substance misuse data sets, that tells us, they've got flags in there that tell us there are people who are experiencing homelessness. So we had a data set we could use. So we could answer the question about prevalence. I'll come on and just show you what the outcome was. That was how we created the data set. I won't dwell on that one. So prevalence, what did we find? This smaller bar, this is how sophisticated my statistics gets. This smaller bar was the prevalence rate for people experiencing homelessness for the period of which we were looking at. 5%. The exact match, not homeless population, they weren't in our data set as homeless, was 6.9%. A higher prevalence rate for the exact match population than not homeless population. To us, that said that for all of the uncertainty in that data and the margins of error, the policy was a success. The qualitative data told us that people weren't dying, and now the quantitative data is saying, look, good job. And then you kind of think, well, why less than the general population? And when we talk qualitative, well, there was a hell of a lot of surveillance. So you lot were kind of left to self-contain. Can you remember back to COVID? I gave you, we had a nice cathartic session earlier, and now I'm traumatizing you again. Look, you were in your own home, but you didn't have a caseworker knocking on your door or checking where you were every day, did you? Yeah, so you might have nipped as things were moving on. You went to see your parents or you went to see somebody. You weren't surveilled in the way that people experiencing homelessness were. We don't know. This is an hypothesis. We don't know, but there was stuff going on for the homeless population that might explain that. Also in terms of networks. So, a success. We were able, with the pretty poor data that we have, to say something about success. We would have liked to have done that with a much better case-level data set from homelessness applications. We also then thought, well, hold on. Vaccinations was the next big thing. I'm nearly done. This is the last bit. So vaccinations was the next big challenge. Okay. So there was a big fight in the sector. Unlike the crisis when it hit and it was about protection, when it came to vaccination, there was more of a scrap. The sector really had to lobby hard to get government to say, we will prioritize people experiencing homelessness for vaccination. Didn't get the same kind of collective response. So that's one thing. We didn't have the same political commitment, but there was. They said, we will commit to prioritize. But unlike the prioritization at point of crisis, where there was money, there was support, there was for communities, for local authorities, there was nothing. It was like, we want you to prioritize, they're on the list so they can get a jab first, but we're done. off you go, make it happen to the communities. And we see the consequence of that when we look at the vaccination rates, which was our second piece of work. And this is basically your vaccination rates of people experiencing homelessness being the bottom line, and the exact match population on the top line. And you can just see the difference. That dotted line is when the announcement came that said we would have prioritization of people experiencing homelessness, but you'd have expected to see the bottom line shoot up more rapidly. You don't, it widens. And then over time, simply the vaccination rates, there's a big difference. You know, just after a year, 81% matched population, 60% homeless population. Yeah, the policy wasn't a success. Yeah, the policy didn't meet its goals. And we were able to do that, but in an imperfect way with the data that we had. So I wanted to take the chance just to talk a bit about homelessness because you gave me a platform to get us all thinking about it. It's detour from my systems talk, sorry, but you gave me a platform. What I want to end on is really to come back and say, I love these conferences. I've learned so much this morning already. I was in a couple of really awesome sessions around benefits data, which I want. Whoever was talking, I didn't get to see you. Yeah, I'd like to talk. But it was to raise awareness of the folk that sit behind the systems, of which I'm not one, but we do have people in here I'm looking at around the room. The architects that put all of that sweat into making them happen in the first place. The legal folk that get brought on board pretty quickly, who we totally depend on, but they don't get to talk at these conferences. The researchers who are there doing the donkey work to make it usable, to actually make that data analyzable to us, to give us the metadata and all those other things. Those folk that sit behind the system, I think I would just want to end with a kind of thank you to them that makes our job of trying to inform policy possible. Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. So we've got 15 minutes for questions. If you get the mic, can you put it really close to your mouth so that Pete can hear you on stage with your question? So fire away. Who's first? Hands there. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Jamie Murphy, ADRC, Northern Ireland. First, thank you for your incredible work. Second, that's one of the most inspiring talks I've heard in a very, very long time. You mentioned the work in Denmark. You mentioned the Danish registry system. It's incredible. It's like Charlie's Chocolate Factory for any population data researcher. To look at what administrative data potentially affords a population overall in terms of the ADR, and specifically in terms of your homelessness research. How does homelessness compare in Denmark to the UK? Is it better? Is it better because of their administrative data system? And if it is better because of the administrative data system, what is it about the administrative data there that has affected change? Thank you.
Fabulous question. It's one I can answer. I feel like an interloper sometimes in these conferences because you guys just know the data so well. It is better. There's only one country in the world that can boast a downward trend, a meaningful downward trend over time. It's not Denmark, it's Finland, but they've adopted a policy approach, and that's what we attribute. It's not the data system they've got in Finland, it's the policy that they've chosen. It's the political will and the political commitment. I could bore you all for hours about what they've done. Housing First, that's what they pursued, something called Housing First, which is like a version of rapid rehousing, but at scale. So that we know is the main driver of success. It hasn't been in Denmark is in a much better place than we are, but it's not because of the data infrastructure. That's an enabler. But we know that the things that primarily end homelessness are housing markets that work, that folk have affordable homes in places where they want to live. Can't just build social housing ghettos, they have to be in places where people want to live, and poverty. And so the Scandinavian countries tend to do fairly well because of the social welfare systems. But the data's an enabler. Yeah.
Right, there's a question right at the very back.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'm Anna Lawrence-Jones, the Public Involvement Lead at Imperial College London. And I was just wondering, thank you for the really interesting talk, but did you involve people who are experiencing homelessness in your research and in any policy making, and how did they influence your decision making?
Oh, good question. So the first answer is that we in the ADR do not do enough in our space, Ian and I, and this is something we reflect on all the time. We don't do enough public involvement in the work we're doing around the data. We don't. And you know, in some of the informal conversations I had in preparing for this and some of the literature, the Be Bold example where you've got the indigenous communities basically saying, do not publish that data. We've not done enough of that, I'll be really honest. In terms of influencing policy, most of my work, there's widespread engagement with people experiencing homelessness. So in the introduction, we talk about developing law. That law was heavily involving people experiencing homelessness. Interestingly, not always funded. So, in fact, I got commissioned to review part of the legislation for Welsh Government, and they were explicit, we're not funding engagement with people experiencing homelessness, that will be done elsewhere. But we made the decision that says we can't do this piece of work without their engagement, which means you go and you buy lunch for a lot of people out of your own pocket. But actually, in this specific area of our work around administrative data, it's a gap that we've not yet addressed. And really what we need to do is systematize it. So any piece of work that there's constant engagement, and we've not cracked that yet in the homelessness space. There is wider, if you look at SAIL, there's widespread public involvement work that goes on. Just to get approvals, you've got to go through that process. But that kind of routine, ongoing engagement, not enough, is the answer. Yeah.
And yeah, question right at the front here.
Hi, so I'm Sally Miles. I'm from the ONS, and I'm probably going to email you at some point because I work in a team called Living Arrangements. So we're trying to produce data on how people live, where they live, from administrative data. And I just had kind of a question on actually, I'll start from the beginning. So two of the things that you mentioned are that kind of anonymization from the kind of point of service before you pass on that data can be kind of beneficial in getting data to more people, but that also adding more questions causes a problem potentially in terms of respondent burden from those people. Given that data linkage is a potential way to get that information, I was wondering what your thoughts are on the balance between anonymization and prioritization, being able to do kind of multivariate analysis.
Okay, so where do I sit in the balance? I'm going to be like our first speaker. I pose the questions and the challenges. It's for you guys to come up with the answers. Inevitably, we end up sitting somewhere in the middle, don't we, I think? And that's where the solution lies. I've worked a lot with the frontline staff, and actually, if you impose too much in terms of those data collections, they just don't do it effectively. They don't. I have so many stories that I can't tell in this platform about data quality in other spaces because it just won't happen. So we have to reduce the burden there. But then I think it then also relates to the question up there. You need to be in a conversation with these populations that you're talking about and with. And again, it relates to this morning's question. If you're using that data through other means, legal routes, that you're going to use that data, you're not going to get consent or whatever, or you're going to do it through loads of data linkage to find all this stuff about people. Are they aware that their data is being used in that way, and are they happy with it? Are you potentially doing harm? So there's a balance, and that's why kind of all those different components of what makes a good data system are, sometimes they'll come up against each other. And so it's balancing it. Like human rights, isn't it? They often come up against each other and you find a balance. That's the answer, I think, from me. So nebulous of an answer, but it's an answer.
Any other questions? Question here near the front, just behind. Yeah.
Hello, Katie Huxley, Cardiff University. I do know Pete, I am going to be nice, promise. Why is it so difficult to get the data off local authorities?
Okay.
And how do we make that easier?
Yeah, good, great. Thanks for the question, Katie, from Cardiff University as well. Okay. Any local authorities in today? Any? Oh, look, you're all so shy. There must be somebody. Yeah, I saw somebody go, yeah, me, don't pick on me. Why is it so hard? I'll give you there's two. One, I don't think yet we've demonstrated effectively enough why it's important to have that data and why it's got to be good quality data. We've tried, I've done a whole load of demonstration stuff that we thought was really powerful and important, but we've not yet won that battle. That's a small part of it. Generally, when you sit down and have a conversation with these frontline, with managers in these spaces, they're kind of warm to it. Then you get into the challenges of actually making it happen. You know, and in Wales, we've got this wonderful sale infrastructure and the support that comes with it to enable you to deposit that data. But somebody in the local authority or several people need to be able to put the time in and go through the legals and be assured that they can do this. And that's just a step further than they have. When you bear in mind that they've had over a decade of austerity and of cutting to the bone their services, and as I said, homelessness rates are rising, their day job is taking precedent. They're working in crisis. So finding the space and the time to do what we need them to do is really, really tough. Yeah. I think that's my sense.
Is there something about them worrying about that data quality that you'll just come back and tell them everything that's wrong with it after all of that work that they've done to facilitate it?
Are they worried about me saying that? I don't think they are. I don't think they are. So the way homelessness is quite specific because we have a legal framework that is the way everything works through. So they have to record certain things. They're meant to report up to government on a whole load of variables, but they do that in aggregate form. They do it in aggregate form, but it means at case level it is there, or at household level it is there. So they've got that data. It has to be of decent enough quality to give to government, Welsh Government in our case. It's there. Yes, when it comes in, anybody that's working, there's a few people in here I know work in that space, know that there are lots of issues. You know, the number of people that live at one address is often very high because it's the council address or it's the whatever address. There's lots of issues with it, but I don't think that's the deterrent. I don't.
Okay, interesting. Right, last question goes to Balint.
Hi, great talk. I'm Balint from Dare UK. I've got a kind of related question, which is, I mean, when you talked about patience and, you know, because these things take years to access data. I was just wondering, you also talked about how COVID also enabled things to happen a lot faster. And I'm wondering whether you've got any thoughts about, particularly around data access, how the lessons that we've learned through COVID are not lost so that we don't revert back to default. Or what can we learn from being able to do this much more quickly, both in terms of, I guess, a data perspective, an access perspective, but also from policy, that doesn't mean that this was just like a weird little thing that happened and we've forgotten all about it. What can we take from it?
Yeah, and you know, there'll be other people here better to answer that in spaces or in fields where data environments have improved. And I know that there are some health, I'm sure, again, I don't know, but I'm sure some of you are sat here going, yeah, the data environment improved massively. It didn't in the homelessness context. The data environment didn't improve. You know, we waited a long time just to get access to the health data to help answer this important question. In fact, it deteriorated in some ways because of the pressures of COVID and budgets and time and everything else. that there was a, right, we'll only report some of this annually, don't give it quarterly anymore, just do it annually. So there's lots of stuff we can't actually say at the moment, or don't worry about reporting that. So there were some backward steps. Then there were a couple of forward steps. So in Wales, you know, I said we didn't have, well, I didn't, but we don't have the chain database in Wales. They created something that looked a bit like it in COVID, and they've kept that going. Data quality issues are all there. It's not national stats, but it's really useful, informative data. But on the policy side, things have changed. In Wales, we used to have a system that was priority need. You're either in or you're out, and now everybody is in. That happened in COVID, and we've not gone back. In England, they've reverted back. They will catch up with us. That's generally what happens, like 5, 6, 7 years down the line, they'll follow suit. That's what happens. Scotland did it like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. So the policy, there's been good steps. Data in my field, no. I think we had our 0 or 1. So
we need to wrap up there, but thank you very much, Pete. Great talk, and got our afternoon off to a fantastic start. Thank you.